Hi, I'm Brian Russell, and I want to talk with you about the pivotal role of Exodus 2:23 and 25 within the book of Exodus and its function in terms of the flow, the narrative flow within God's movement from God's people from slavery in Egypt to freedom to serve God beginning at Mount Sinai. Now, if you think about the way the book's unfolded so far, there's an open question about God's activity, right? If you look at Exodus chapters 1 and 2, or more specifically, Exodus 1:1 to 2:22, you might observe that there hasn't been a lot of activity by God. In fact, the only mention of God is in the narrative about the Hebrew midwives, where it says that their actions were rooted in the fear of God and that God, because of their faithfulness, gave them families. But you might think of a couple of things immediately. It's like, okay, that's great, but what about all the Israelites who have been enslaved? And what about all the Israelites who are essentially suffering, again, from hard labor? The midwives acted faithfully, and they're essentially thwarting what Pharaoh wanted to do. But now Pharaoh has a new order where essentially all Egypt has been brought into this goal of eliminating the next generation of Israelites by throwing all the Hebrew boys, into the Nile River. Right? That's a big problem. So where is God? Well, what I want you to look at here for a minute is that this essential absence of God, and again, we're not suggesting that ontologically God is not present, but what we do have to observe is that there's a contrast between this section of Exodus and what's going to happen very soon, where God is going to appear to Moses in a burning bush, where God is going to unleash essentially the forces of nature and almost uncreation in what we call the plagues or the signs. There's going to be the Passover, the Red Sea. God's going to come down on Mount Sinai and speak the Ten Commandments. There's going to be the aftermath of the golden calf. All of these incredible miracles are going to be taking place very soon in the next pages, which kind of makes this sort of quiet period, at least in terms of God's activity, interesting. And if you think about it, it isn't just Exodus 1:1 to 2:2 that's like this. This actually extends back to Genesis 37 to 50, where essentially the primary activities of God took place in dreams. Otherwise, it was essentially faithful actions, the faithful actions of Joseph, for example, that drive the story forward. So there's that. And so at this point, then we get to 2:22 to 23, but also ponder the shift in this book in the Exodus. In a sense, we have this rise of a Pharaoh who doesn't know. This is the Hebrew word yada, Joseph, right? That's early on in the first couple of verses. You can look back on that, and that is Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, where a Pharaoh, a new king over Egypt who does not know Joseph, does not know the stories about that. And then this leads to attempts at genocide that, by the way, are only thwarted by the faithful actions of women. So this has something very profound to say about the activities of women in God's redemption of Israel, but it also points, again, to an unexpected source for redemption. You think, okay, where's the warrior men? They're not doing anything, and let alone where is God? Where's Yahweh? But we have faithful women in terms of the midwives. We have Moses' mother, and then even Pharaoh's daughter, ironically, is going to be an agent here. So we have the activities of women versus essentially the absence of God. Now we're also going to see in Exodus 15, verses 19 to 21, the return of women being present, and they're going to be leading the worship. We'll say more about that when we get to it, but notice then that there's going to essentially be a inclusio of the activities of women around God's redemption of God's people in Israel. Then we get the birth of Moses, which is the expectation of something good. But as we know, it ends up with Moses murdering an Egyptian and that becoming known, and he then has to flee from Egypt into the Sinai. And so the hero is gone, and in fact, 222 ends this first section of Israel, of Exodus, quite miserably with the statement that he names his son Gershom, and he says, I'm a stranger in a strange land, which is double entendre, double meaning. Both Moses and his family are in a strange land, but also it reminds us about what about God's people who are not only strangers, but in fact unwelcome guests. They're actually slaves back in Egypt. So what's going to happen? So in a sense, the book of Exodus starts off again with Israel flourishing. I should have put that up here at the top. So in many ways, you can see it's kind of moving into a downward place until we have stranger in a strange land. Or I'm a sojourner in a strange land, however you want to say that. Who's going to help God's people? Well, this is where 223 comes into the mix, in 225. And you know this text. It talks about after many days, the king of Egypt died, and the groans, and the Israelites were groaning under their burdens. So they're under their slavery, under their suffering, and they cried. Now, what's fascinating about that is just as they cried and they're groaning, but notice there's not really an object for that. So this is not, I don't think we have to interpret this as being they're crying out to God. Now, here's the interesting thing about this, though. The Israelites are just suffering. They're groaning. They're crying. And then the text says, and their cries went up to God. So in other words, they're loud enough that God is hearing. It doesn't actually say they directed them towards God. Their cries have gone up to God, again, because of their labor, because of their burden. Notice that recurrence in 223 of that phrase, men ha-abodah, from their toil. Because this is going to be, remember, the book of Exodus, and that root there is, the root from that word ha-abadah is the root that we get the word for servant or slave out of, avad. This is going to be a key word. And remember that Israel's going to leave the illegitimate service of Pharaoh and be brought into the legitimate, creation-honoring, God's mission-fulfilling service of Yahweh. All right, and so Israel is not going to lose labor. They're going to be serving a different king. And in fact, the word that we see, abadah, that can also be used in reference for the tabernacle. So they're building the legitimate house or tabernacle of the Lord. So anyway, that's verse 24. And then in verse 23, then in verses 24 to 25, we get these significant statements about Yahweh and about God. Verse 24, and God heard their groans, their cries. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the Israelites, the sons of Israel, and God knew. So notice we have the recurrence in verses 24 to 25. This is kind of this pivotal passage, 4 verbs that are relational. We have hear, remember, see, these are all past tense, of course, and knew. So God heard. This is Hebrew Shema. God remembered. Zakar. God saw. Ra'ah. And God knew. Again, notice the connection there. And in all these places, we have a fourfold recurrence of the word for God, Elohim. God. Now, what's significance about these words? Again, finally, this is the sense that God is showing up, right? We've wondered where God was. We kind of pondered the way that God's been acting. And now from this point in the book forward, God is going to be powerfully present to do for God's people what they can't do for themselves, and frankly, what no other God has ever done for a people. This is the core of Israel's story now. And again, notice the relational language. God heard. And even if, in fact, maybe the Israelites weren't even crying out to God, God still heard. That's a powerful statement. An oppressed people crying out. Maybe no one else is listening, but God heard. Then we have this interesting piece that God remembered. Now, what's important is not to think of this that somehow God had forgotten about God's people, right? If we go back and read Genesis, God had already talked about how Israel was going to be enslaved for hundreds of years. That goes back to when God was speaking with Abraham. And there's also an interesting piece about remember. The last time we've seen this verb, God remembered, would be in Genesis 8:1, right in the middle of the flood, where it says that the Lord remembered Noah. Again, God hadn't forgot about the only human beings alive floating around in an ark. Right? What did it mean? At that point in the story, that's where the flood begins to recede. In other words, when we see in Scripture that God remembered, that means that God is poised, ready to act. And it's interesting, what is God remembering? God, and specifically here, is remembering the covenant. Those promises that God had made. And who did God make that covenant with and make those promises to? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Just notice as we go through Exodus, especially these next few chapters, how often God or the Scriptures refer to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God of Israel's ancestors is the same God who's going to deliver God's people from the Exodus, who is the same God as the Creator. So the Creator is the Redeemer. That's significant because God is not multi-gods. This isn't polytheism where there's different gods who do different things. This is the same God. And it's also going to be significant as we see in chapters 3 and 6 when God reveals God's actual name as Yahweh. This Yahweh is going to be connected with the God that the Israelite ancestors worshiped by a different name. So this is all significant. So God remembered. God is poised, ready, willing, and about to deliver God's people powerfully out of Egypt and bring them into God's presence at Sinai and commission them to be God's missional people for the sake of the world. Now, quickly, what else do we want to do? This God saw, another relational word. So God isn't just some inanimate object or force or the universe. This is a personal being. Again, notice that language. And the last thing it says profoundly is that God knew. Isn't that good news that God knew? Can we back it up? A Pharaoh came up over Egypt who didn't know Israel. But the good news for the Israelites, maybe the Pharaohs didn't know Joseph or didn't know about their roots or even what God had done for Egypt in the past. But we have an announcement that God knows. And this is a significant word because this has to do in the book of Exodus with relationship at some level, but also it's going to be this key word about revelation because there's going to be a lot of characters in the next few chapters who don't know who God is, who Yahweh is, or who need to learn new things about who God or Yahweh is. So for example, here we have God knew, so God knows, and so God is going to act. And again, beginning in chapter 3, God calls Moses, and the whole episode of deliverance begins to unfold. But it starts with knew, right? And If we look at chapter 5, once Moses appears before Pharaoh, notice the language. If you look at chapter 5, when Moses speaks to Pharaoh about the need to let God's people go, the Pharaoh says, I do not know the Lord. And as I like to say, a lot of times when we're teaching, we say there's no stupid questions, but Pharaoh asks a really bad question. Who is the Lord? I don't know the Lord. Well, the rest of the book of Exodus is going to clearly reveal the power, the prestige, the saving ability, the calling that Yahweh is going to bring to God's people. And so this book takes a dramatic shift here that then leads to the deliverance and the Sinai covenant, which ultimately leads to the presence of Yahweh. The glory of the Lord will come down and fill the tabernacle, be at the center of Israel's community, and then lead God's people into mission on the world to be God's kingdom of priests in a holy nation. But again, it starts with a shift. Again, notice the relational language. Notice how all these words turn the story away from a God who's mostly absent into a God who's powerfully present, who reveals who God is, and who calls God's people into this ministry of practicing the presence of Yahweh as a missional people. We'll call it a holy missional people. Okay, that's a little bit on 2:23 to 25 and how that fits in the rest of the book. I'm Brian Russell. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.